Tonight, we are pleased to welcome award-winning author and Texas Weekly writer-at-large Nate Blakeslee. Mr. Blakeslee's first book, Tulia, won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, the Texas Institute of Letters Nonfiction Prize, and was named a New York Times notable book. His newest book, American Wolf, A True Story of Survival and Obsession in the West, introduces us to the famed Yellowstone wolf, 06, and utilizes her journey as a pack leader and social media star to tell the story of the sometimes controversial Yellowstone Wolf Reintroduction Program. Writer Margaret Atwood called American Wolf gripping and fascinating, and just last week, NPR's Science Friday named it one of the best science books of 2017. Please join me in welcoming writer and journalist Nate Blakeslee.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's cold, at least by Austin, Texas standards. It's very cold. I appreciate it. And thanks to the Louisville Free Public Library for the invitation and for hosting. This is such a wonderful building and a wonderful institution. I've heard so much about it. This is my first trip to Louisville. I had my first hot brown sandwich this morning, which I'm told is a Louisville institution, and which I thoroughly enjoyed. I rode a bike along the river, which is, they say everything's bigger in Texas. We don't have any rivers that are a mile wide. We're lucky if they even have water in them at all. So thank you for making me feel so welcome. I appreciate it. I want to start this reading, or at least try to, with a howl. And rather than do that myself, I thought I would play this recording of a howl I have on my phone. I'm going to put it right up to the mic. If we're all very quiet, hopefully we can hear it. If you lived in this part of the Ohio River Valley 200 years ago, you probably would have heard that every night when you went to sleep. Wolves were once the most widely distributed land mammals on the planet. They were found everywhere, almost everywhere in the northern hemisphere. They were found everywhere in North America, from just north of Mexico City to the Arctic Circle. When the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, there were perhaps as many as 2 million wolves in North America. Today, Homo sapiens is the most widely distributed land mammal on the planet, and wolves live essentially on the margins of human civilization. In the lower 48 states, they were almost entirely eliminated by the end of the 19th century, first by fur trappers, and then later by cattlemen protecting livestock. By the end of the 19th century, you could find them only in this narrow strip, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, upper Minnesota, Wisconsin. Today, they are back. They have been reintroduced to 2 places in the Northern Rockies in the mid-90s, to Yellowstone National Park and to a wilderness area in central Idaho. The project was immensely successful, and wolves have now recolonized a large part of their former range in the Northern Rockies, up there in that Montana, Idaho, Wyoming area. And this book tells the story of one of those wolves, or the descendant of one of those original wolves brought down from Canada to recolonize Yellowstone National Park. She happened to become famous by virtue of living in the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone, which has become the most popular place in the world to watch wolves. In fact, it's the only place in the world where you can reliably spot wolves from the roadside using a spotting scope, a kind of telescope used for watching wildlife. She was not the first famous wolf in Yellowstone, but she sort of came of age in that 2006 to 2012 period when Facebook was exploding. So she was the first sort of social media phenomenon wolf in Yellowstone. The book tells the story of her pack's sort of rise to power, how she became so famous, but it does it largely from her own perspective. It reads like a novel in which the main characters are wolves. I'll explain a bit how such a thing is possible, but first I thought I would just show you what that's like by doing a short reading, if it's okay with everybody. This is from chapter 3, which is called A Star is Born. At this point in the story, 06 is not yet famous. This is in late 2009, but she has sort of gotten onto the radar screen of regular wolf watchers at the park. She's a lone wolf. She's left her natal pack. She's gone out into another pack's territory to try to find a mate and to establish her own territory. And the area in which she's trying to do this is the Lamar Valley, which is by far the best wolf habitat in the park. It's been controlled by this same clan known as the Druids since reintroduction. By far the most well-known pack in the park. They had 3 documentaries made about them. They're sort of the most powerful kind of pack in the park. They're kind of like the royalty of Yellowstone wolves, like the Kennedy family of wolves of the Northern Rockies. But she is trying to draw a male out from their ranks. As this chapter opens, she's right on the edge of the Lamar Valley in an area called Little America in the park. The Druids have controlled the Lamar Valley for 10 years at this point, but they're in trouble. They're in decline. They've lost their alpha male, the top male in the pack, and the alpha female, who's known as White Line, is desperately trying to find a replacement and to hold the pack together. And much more ominously, the pack has been afflicted with mange, a very severe case of mange to the point where it's become life-threatening. So the stage is set, and I'll just read you a few pages. Okay. 06 had been howling for days, and at last it had paid off. Atop a partially forested knoll on the western edge of Little America, she stood nose to nose with 2 young black wolves, a pair of roaming brothers who had only recently made a tentative stab at joining the ranks of the Druids. They were both yearlings, though one was noticeably larger, already over 100 pounds, with room on his lanky frame for more if he continued to eat well. The bigger brother had a salt and pepper muzzle and a white blaze on his breast shaped like a cross. He was acutely interested in 06, sniffing her as she stood still, tail held high, and allowed herself to be inspected. But it was the smaller of the brothers who was clearly in charge, and he was the one 06 wanted. This wolf's jaw was stippled with gray, as were his withers and chest, making him look older and more weathered than his brother, though in reality, neither had much experience being away from their natal pack. His eyes were a light tan color, almost yellow. As he stood motionless, transfixed by the female in front of him, the jilted brother approached his sibling at a crawl, first reaching up to lick at his chin, then turning on his back in the snow to gently paw at his face. He looked like an overgrown pup, which wasn't far from the truth. 06 laid her chin across the smaller brother's back. The 3 of them lingered there, on the hilltop, under a cobalt blue sky, 3 interlopers far from home, and considered one another. 06 wandered down off the knoll to the west, and the brothers followed. White Line had been lingering just out of sight on the far end of the knoll with 2 of her sisters, oblivious to the encounter taking place nearby. Suddenly, the Druids seemed to realize that they could no longer smell the 2 males. They began trotting west to investigate. 06 was halfway up a neighboring ridge when the trio appeared far below, 3 black wolves in a line, scent trailing her and the 2 males. Hers was a smell they had become very familiar with, and they were never pleased to find it. Now she raced across the face of the ridge and down through the forested slopes on its far side, heading for a low spot in the Lamar River known as Buffalo Ford. The brothers followed hesitantly. Even in their weakened state, the Druids managed to close the distance, and for a moment, the brothers seemed torn between their new acquaintance and the pack they had recently adopted as their own. Eventually, the smaller black peeled off and headed back towards the Druid females. His brother chose instead to follow 06 as she headed south across the frozen river. The Druids had no real chance of catching 06, who almost seemed to be enjoying the chase. The running they had already done had cost the pursuers energy they couldn't afford to spend. Having recovered at least one of their males, the 3 sisters clustered, exhausted, in the lee of a basalt cliff. One of them collapsed in the snow, while White Line, whose mange was too severe to lie down on such an icy bed, stood over her, trying to nap standing up. 06 led her remaining prize up to the top of a prominent butte and then paused on an exposed ledge where the pair bedded down. She had chosen a spot with a commanding view of Little America, less than a mile from where her pursuers were resting. Why had she stopped? She had found a willing mate, albeit not perhaps her first choice, and she was on the far western edge of Druid territory. She had only to lead the male a bit farther away from her rivals, and she'd be home free, with the prospect of starting her own pack in a territory relatively unvisited by neighboring clans. Yet she lingered. She had been playing hide-and-seek with the Druids for weeks, gambling with her life on a daily basis for a chance to be near the two new males. She was an excellent hunter. What she needed was a piece of land where she didn't have to risk her life every time she went looking for a meal. Little America was good habitat, but most of it belonged to the Druids, and the Druids did not tolerate trespassers. At least, that had always been true in the past. In 2 months of chasing 06, this generation of Druids had never come close to catching her. She should have been dead by now, but here she was, not only alive, but the healthiest, most vital wolf for miles around. High on her perch, 06 seemed to be waiting for the smaller male, bedded far below with the miserable Druid females, to make a decision. She didn't howl, but it seemed she didn't need to. After a brief respite, the male stood up and wandered a short distance away from the resting females, his nose to the ground. He caught the scent he was looking for, and moments later, he was gone. The Druids, too exhausted to follow, howled helplessly. When the black reached his brother and 06, there were warm greetings all around, as if the three had been together for years. Shortly thereafter, as the Druids' unanswered howls echoed off Specimen Ridge, the trio set out together once again. 06 paused to urinate. Instead of squatting, she raised her leg to scent mark a tree, then scratched the earth nearby lest her sign be missed somehow. It was the mark of an alpha female, and its message was unmistakable. This land is mine. The two males inspected her mark and then added their own on top. They were hers too. How could I possibly know all of that? These are wild animals. I'm setting this timer so I don't talk too long. These are wild animals. So how could you possibly have access to that level of detail so that you could tell the story like that? You could describe their emotions, you could describe what they appeared to be thinking and feeling. The answer is, 06 was watched probably by thousands of people during her lifetime. People who would come to the park, would pause for just a few moments on the side of the road, would see watchers looking through scopes, would ask them what they were seeing, and then would look themselves through the scopes. She had become, by, say, 2010, one of the main attractions in that part of the park. She was something to see at Yellowstone, like Old Faithful or Tower Falls. Now, those people obviously did not collect enough detail to write a scene like this, but, crucially, there was this much smaller number of people, this subculture of sort of die-hard, wolf-loving fans, wolf aficionados, people who would come to the park every single day, track the wolves using the radio signals from their telemetry collars. One wolf in each pack has a collar on, and you can find them using these telemetry signals, and then get them in their scopes and watch them all day long, every day. And one woman in particular, this retired school teacher from San Diego, her name was Lori Lyman, she took daily notes. She took 3 years' worth of daily notes on 06 and her pack. And when I got to the park and told her what I wanted to do, this book I wanted to write, she said, well, you'll need this. And she gave me this treasure trove. It was essentially the diary of a wolf, or of a wolf pack. And I read through it, and it was a gold mine. I mean, Lori was there. She witnessed this scene, she and her friends. She saw 06 meet the wolf that would become her mate. She saw 06 outsmart and later outfight White Line, the alpha female of the Druids. She saw 06 take over the Lamar Valley. She and thousands of other people watched her raise her first litter of pups. The first den she chose was about 1.5 miles from the road, but it was perfectly visible from the road, so everyone saw these pups. She watched '06 defend the den from grizzlies. She watched this much larger and more aggressive pack invade the Lamar Valley and try to take it from '06. All of these amazing scenes were in the notes. Now, not every page of the notes was filled with amazing scenes, and there was a lot of mundane stuff in there. And it was 2,400 pages, and I had to read it all and take notes on it. So it was a mixed blessing, but the journalist in me said, you know, imagine what you could do with this material. You could write a book that reads like a novel, in which the main characters were animals, like a Jack London story, except it's all true. So that's what I've done. But that is not the only story that the book tells. The book also tells the story of this political fight that was going on, contemporaneous with the events described with '06 and her pack. That was going on in courtrooms and in Congress and in state legislatures over how wolves should be managed in the West. Because there were those who did not celebrate the reintroduction of wolves to the Rockies and who were not glad that it was such an amazingly successful project. All of those same ranchers, the descendants of those same ranchers who hunted those wolves out of the northern Rockies over 100 years ago, they're all still there. They're all still running in cattle and sheep, not in Yellowstone, of course, but around Yellowstone. And they very much opposed reintroduction, and they leaned on their state legislatures to oppose it too. Also, elk hunting is really big business in the northern Rockies. If you're a guide for elk hunting, you can charge $5,000 for an out-of-town client to guide them on an elk hunt in the national forest near Yellowstone. If you run a motel or a restaurant that caters to elk hunters, elk hunting is big business, and wolves eat a lot of elk. And so they were very much opposed to the reintroduction too. The reason reintroduction was necessary in the view of the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is that Yellowstone was a broken ecosystem. All of the wolves had been hunted out essentially by the 1920s. The last wolves in the park, ironically, were killed by park rangers. In those days, they had a very rudimentary understanding of what an ecosystem was and how it worked. And they genuinely believed that left to their own devices, the wolves would destroy those large herds of elk and deer that had made the park so famous, that had led Congress to name it the first national park in the United States. They did not realize that wolves and elk had coexisted on that landscape for thousands of years, that they had in fact evolved in tandem with one another, which is why an elk can run exactly as fast as a wolf, but no faster. In fact, there is this wolf-shaped hole in ecosystems all across the northern hemisphere. Wolves were the animals that shaped those ecosystems more than any other predator. The reason that a white-tailed deer is so nimble, the reason that a bighorn sheep can go straight up the side of a mountain, the reason a moose is so enormous, all of those were traits that were selected for over centuries or millennia of predation by wolves. Wolves literally shaped the natural world around them. And so what you saw in Yellowstone after they were killed off was this explosion in the elk population. Elk are in the deer family, but they are enormous animals. There's a reason the males are called bulls. The biggest ones can be 700 pounds. They don't live lightly on the landscape. And their numbers just exploded once the wolves were removed, so much so that the habitat began to degrade, and even the rangers could see that. And so what they did was they were reduced to essentially replacing wolves with bullets. They started shooting elk, culling thousands of them every winter, usually when there were no visitors around. It became sort of like Yellowstone's dirty little secret. The idea that wolves might be a more holistic way to solve that problem had been around since the 1940s. But it was extremely controversial, and it didn't get done until the mid-90s. By that time, the culling of the elk had stopped. The reason it had stopped was, if you've been to Yellowstone and you've seen those marvelous elk herds in the park in the summer, what you may or may not know is that those elk are migratory, and in the winter they come down out of Yellowstone, which is an unbelievably snowy and cold place. They come down out of there into these surrounding valleys around the park, which makes for some of the best elk hunting, in the United States, and people flock there from all over the country. So if you were a hunter that was used to hunting that Yellowstone herd, or you ran a guide service or a restaurant or motel, you never thought there were too many elk in Yellowstone. You thought there were just the right number of elk in Yellowstone, and it had been that way for a long time, and you were used to it. So it was extremely controversial from day one. And the deal that was made was the federal government said, if the ranching community will get on board, if the hunters will get on board, if these state legislators will get on board, what we promise is that as soon as the wolves are sufficiently numerous and the population is stable, we will turn control back over to the states, which everyone knew at the time would mean there would be a hunting season for wolves again and a trapping season eventually. And that was the deal that was made. Now, of course, the devil is always in the details, and the anti-wolf forces thought that that safe, stable level had been reached a long time ago. And the federal government disagreed, and this fight went on and on for years. And even after the federal government said, okay, it's time to turn control over to the states, pro-wolf forces, environmental advocates, the Sierra Club, resisted and said no. And lawsuit after lawsuit was filed. And from the perspective of the Western legislatures and the hunters and the ranchers, they felt like a promise had been broken. And the politics became more and more bitter and more poisonous. To give you an idea of how poisonous, at the time that reintroduction happened, a bill was introduced into the Wyoming state legislature offering a bounty to anyone who shot a wolf dispersing from Yellowstone and directing the state to provide for the legal defense of anyone that the federal government tried to prosecute for shooting an endangered wolf. Now that bill never became law, but it was good politics. Similarly, the current governor of Idaho, whose name is Butch Otter, and no, I'm not making that up, his name is Butch Otter, he ran on a platform of eliminating wolves. He promised to drive the number of wolves down just as low as he could as soon as they came off the endangered species list. And he has done his best to do that, because in 2009, wolves finally did come off the endangered species list in Idaho, and they began trapping and hunting them there. And then in 2012, finally they came off in Wyoming. So today, wolves are hunted and trapped all around Yellowstone. But the political fight continues. The next phase will be, the next sort of argument will be whether or not wolves ought to be protected when they leave sort of that larger northern Rockies area and start going into Washington or Oregon or California. Should they be protected there from hunting and from culling on behalf of livestock? And then two, there is a movement afoot to reintroduce them in the southern Rockies as well, into the state of Colorado. And so we're about to have this entire debate over again. But the same conditions exist in Colorado. Colorado eliminated all of its predators, all of its wolves, decades and decades ago. And now there are far too many deer in Colorado, and it's damaging the habitat there. But there's another reason why the politics around the issue has become so poisonous. It has raised tensions, and it has inflamed passions out of all proportion to any impact that wolves actually have had on anyone's life or livelihood. Livestock have been lost, but not on the scale that was predicted. For example, in Wyoming last year, about 230 cattle and sheep were killed by wolves. There are 1.5 million cattle and sheep in the state of Wyoming in any given year. Tens of thousands are lost to bad weather or disease. The state of Wyoming compensates ranchers 7 times the value of any sheep or cow lost to wolves. So ranchers have largely been made whole. Likewise, the elk hunting business is still good. It's not as good if you live just east of the park, because that Yellowstone herd is much smaller. But again, that was a goal of the program to begin with. If you didn't share that goal, you aren't likely to celebrate the success of it. But elsewhere in Wyoming and in Montana and Idaho, the elk harvest, as they call the number of elk that are shot every year, has been robust. Now, there is another character in the book who is a hunter, a wolf hunter. The reason he's in the book is, and I'll tell you this even though it gives away the ending, but this story was huge news. And in fact, this is how I found about 06's life to begin with, her story to begin with. During that first legal hunting season in the state of Wyoming, in the winter of 2012, one of the very first wolves shot was the 06 female. I don't know how many people in this room already knew that that was the case. Yeah, it was really big news at the time. The New York Times covered it the day after she was shot. The world's most famous wolf shot east of Yellowstone. The backlash against it was just enormous. And I had taken a wolf watching class in Yellowstone back in 2007, and I'd sort of followed the issue from afar, but I knew I wanted to write about it, but I wasn't sure how. And I saw that story in the Times, and it just seemed like the perfect angle, the perfect way to get into the story. Because, you know, who could have anticipated that one of the very first wolves shot would be this celebrated wolf? And I knew that when people saw that story in the Times, the first thing that they would ask, the thing that they would want to know before anything else was, who would do such a thing? Who would kill this animal who had brought so much joy to so many people? Who would end this amazing story? And I knew as a journalist the only way to answer that question was to find the person that did it and ask him. The problem was nobody knew who that person was. He had wisely kept his name out of the papers. To give you an idea of how sensitive the issue is, it's against the law for a state official in Wyoming to reveal the name of a person who has shot a wolf or the location in which the wolf was shot, just because they anticipated that there would be this kind of backlash. And he probably would have been like the Minnesota dentist who shot Cecil the lion. It probably would have been that kind of story if he had allowed his name to be in the papers. But by the time I found him, and he wasn't that hard to find, you know, he lives east of Yellowstone. This valley that he lives in, there's maybe 50 people there. You know, you could knock on every door if you wanted to and eventually find the person. By the time I found him, he had changed his mind. And he was ready to talk. He was ready to tell his side of the story. Partly that was just luck. He had happened to watch this documentary that ran on the Nat Geo channel about '06. It didn't have anything about wolf hunting politics, or didn't have any people in it at all. It just told the story of her pack. But at the very end, it said, there was this kind of ominous voiceover, and it said, and her life was cut short by a hunter's bullet. And it was like a stock photography image of a hunter. And something about that just didn't sit right with him. You know, he said, I'm not a stock photography image of a hunter. I am a person. And I have a story, and I have a perspective, and he was ready to tell his story. The only thing that he sort of insisted on was that his name not be used. And so in the book, he has a pseudonym. I call him Stephen Turnbull. And so in a series of interviews in his cabin in the woods, he told me what it was like to be the person that had shot the world's most famous wild animal. He was not an anti-wolf ideologue, like a lot of his friends were. He didn't think every wolf should be killed. He was extremely defensive during that first interview. He kept saying over and over again, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. And legally speaking, he was right. He didn't do anything wrong. He had a permit to shoot her. She had left the park, so she was fair game. But morally, I think even he a little bit was on the fence about it. And for him, it had been this extremely surreal experience. I mean, he shot her, or he shot a wolf. He had no idea she was 06. He had never heard of 06. He didn't know that there were famous wolves in the park. He lives in this entirely different subculture, this hunting culture that exists east of the park. So he had done this thing at dawn in one of the most remote places in the lower 48, and the next day it's around the world, and people are judging him for what he had done. And this is a person who has never sent an email, never used Google, doesn't have a landline in his cabin. We communicated mostly by texts. He has this antenna on top of his cabin that allows him to send and receive texts, and that's about it. So he lives in this sort of bubble. You know, to him it's still sort of like the 19th century. And in his own way, he was as obsessed with wildlife as Lori Lyman or any of the other watchers in the park were. He had built his entire life around hunting elk. He lived in this cabin. He did odd jobs so that he could stay in the woods. He had a house in Cody in town, and he'd owned a business at one time, and he'd just been on this sort of downwardly mobile trajectory that secretly he was glad of, because it allowed him to stay in the woods doing what he loved to do. I said in the book that he was like a ski bum, you know, with a rifle and a bow and arrow instead of a pair of skis. And he wasn't shy about it. He told me. And he lived for the fall hunting season. In the spring, he hunted black bear. In the summer, he would go out and he would stalk elk with his video camera and take videos of them. He would collect shed elk antlers and fill his truck with them and sell them in town. And he was obsessed with wildlife. And to him, the reintroduction project had been a disaster. There were far fewer elk in Crandall, which is this valley he lived in, than there were when he was a kid. And it didn't matter to him that there were an artificially inflated number. He didn't care. To him, that's the number of elk that were supposed to be in the woods. And there were a lot of things that he valued about those woods. He knows that he lives in a very special place, Yellowstone, Greater Yellowstone, which is what they call not only the park, but this area of national forest and other protected areas around the park. It's the largest remaining essentially intact temperate ecosystem in the world. He knows he lives in a special place, but among the things that he values there is not a balanced ecosystem. That is not something that matters to him. And it's not something that matters to most sportsmen. What they want is a surplus of elk or a surplus of deer so that there will be plenty available in the fall to shoot. So the story becomes one less, and we are less arguing about facts than we're arguing about values when it comes to wolves. And this was nowhere better illustrated to me than when during that first interview with him, he told me about the day that he shot her. He told me about what that was like for him. And then he asked me, "Do you want to see it?" And I had no idea exactly what he was referring to. It didn't immediately occur to me what he was referring to, but he was talking about 06's pelt. It hadn't occurred to me that he would have that pelt there in the cabin. And I had spent, by that time, months with the watchers in the park, hearing all these amazing stories. I had never seen her myself in person, but hearing all these amazing stories about what she had done. She was the queen of this wilderness beyond compare, and all the elk that she had run down, and the pups that she had raised, and the battles she had won with rival packs. And he goes back in his bedroom, he comes out, and she's just hanging there on 2 fingers. He puts her on this hook on the wall, and he says, "Now there's a trophy." And it was, I'm a Texan, and I grew up around hunters. I don't hunt myself, but I've been around hunters and on ranches all my life, and I've seen a lot of dead animals. But it was upsetting for me. And I had no idea how to explain to him in that cabin why that might be. And it occurred to me that we were both standing there, and we were looking at the exact same object hanging on his wall, and we were having these diametrically opposed emotions. Our response to it was so different. And later on, when I got back to my own cabin and I thought about what I'd seen and the notes that I'd taken, and that's when I realized how rich the story really was, because it's a story about a cultural clash. It's a story about conflicting values in the West. It's a story that's much bigger than wolves. This fight in the West has been going on for decades, and it's about who controls the land and who should have the right to make decisions in the West, because so much of the West is controlled by the federal government. 2/3 of the state of Idaho is federal land. And people in Idaho feel like they don't control the resources that are in their own backyard, or Wyoming or Montana, and this resentment against the federal government has been building and building and building. You saw it in the Bundy trial that's going on right now in Las Vegas. He's the rancher that refused to pay his grazing fees to the federal government, and there was an armed standoff in Nevada, and then later with his son in Oregon. That's an extreme example, but that sort of sentiment has been building and building and building for decades. And to them, wolves is just sort of the latest chapter, something that the federal government crammed down their throats against their will, and they're not going to sit back. They're going to fight it. And so that's when I realized that it was a much larger story than just what happened with 06 and the people that loved her and sort of the people that feared her, that it was a story about sort of what the West means to people and what sort of future that we're all sort of fighting over, of what sort of future the West will have and what sort of West we will leave to our children. And that, as a journalist, you want that sort of engaging story, a story that not only that people are talking about, but a story that, allows you to say something larger about where the country is headed and what's going on in the country. This might be a good stopping point. I'm going to leave some time for questions and answers, but that's how I found the story. That's the gist of what the story is about. I hope it has been of interest to you. I can definitely hear you. I don't know. No.
Native Americans, do they have any part of this equation, either their lands or the people?
Yeah, there's the reservation in Wyoming, which does have a wolf population on it, and they do have some say in how those wolves are managed. But by and large, it was the federal government, and now it's state governments that control what's going on up there. Now in Canada, there's a lot of First Nations that do have sort of autonomy over their own land, and there are thousands and thousands of wolves in Canada. The interesting thing about the Native American perspective is, this sort of demonizing of wolves, it goes back a long, long way. It's as old as recorded history. And it coincides with the first time that humans began raising livestock as part of their livelihood. That's when wolves were first sort of perceived to be the enemy. And it goes all the way back to medieval times, the werewolf tale, the Grimm's fairy tales, all the wolf metaphors that we have in which the wolf is always the bad guy. But interestingly, in cultures where livestock raising never became a way of life, there's an entirely different view of wolves. For example, in most Native American cultures, the wolf, the mythology around the wolf is that he or she is a friend to man or a source of wisdom, a font of wisdom. There's this great book by Barry Lopez, came out in the late 70s, of Wolves and Men, and it tells of this whole history between the two species, why and how humans felt driven to wipe out every last wolf, in most of the Northern Hemisphere, and a lot of wonderful, wonderful reporting on Native American attitudes. Yes, sir.
Okay. I had the privilege of working in Yellowstone when the wolves were introduced in 96, after 95, and 97, 98, and I got to see the packs a lot. And I never knew about 06 somehow or other, but the people I saw mostly with the spotters were looking for bears.
Bears, yeah.
You could see the wolves at night if you went over in Lamar Valley, and sometimes occasionally you would see two different packs. And one way you could tell that they were there is the elk would move, they would keep moving away.
Yeah, yeah.
And, there's two, I'm a hunter, but I know hunters do support a lot of wildlife. The thing that's interesting, and I really got a kick out of seeing the wolves, but one of the reasons that the wolves get shot is that they get used to people. And so the guy that shot the wolf, is the way I read the book, was like shooting it in somebody's front yard.
Yeah.
And the wolf looked at him, and it's just another person that I've been used to seeing all my life.
Yeah, you're right. She had become tolerant of people.
That's a danger.
Yeah.
But the other good thing is I'm a trout fisherman, and with the advent of the wolves, the elk have quit eating all the willows and the brush off the banks, so the waters have gotten clearer. Hopefully the trout fishing will get better. And it goes back to your discussing their part in maintaining an ecosystem.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's been a huge story out of Yellowstone, is now that we're 20 years into the project, we can step back and evaluate how well wolf reintroduction has done, whether it's healed the ecosystem. And as you say, one of the things it's done is, well, there are fewer elk in the park for one thing, but the elk have also started behaving differently. After decades of not being preyed upon, they basically started behaving like cattle. They would hang out in these valleys in large numbers. They would eat their preferred foods. They spent a lot of time on the stream side, eating willow and other vegetation that is there to support the stream side, and they degraded trout habitat. And now they're much spookier, and they're less willing to hang out in those valleys, and they stay up higher up in the mountains because of that year-round predation from wolves. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
The other thing a predator like that does is he culls the weakest in the herd. So you end up with a stronger herd.
Unlike a hunter with a rifle, they tend to look for the weakest member of the of the herd. Yeah.
Also help the bears in the park, because the bears are smart. When they see the wolf pack go by, they follow them.
Yeah.
And after
You
they
read
make-
this whole book, didn't you?
And they make a kill. When they make a kill, then the bear takes over.
They do. They
So
do.
it's interesting how
They
that
do.
works out.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm assuming elk hunters are hunting for the meat, and wolf hunters?
No, you can't eat a wolf. They are hunting for that trophy. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of elk hunters are doing that too. But this guy, Turnbull, who shot 06, he was an elk hunter, and he was a subsistence hunter. He would shoot an elk, and then he would keep the meat in his freezer all year long. He never bought meat at the store. He looked down on people that bought meat at the store. And he would make elk jerky and elk burger, and he gave me some elk jerky. I mean, it was the best jerky that I had ever had, you know. He's very good at what he does, and he considers himself to be a very ethical hunter. But he told me he felt like he had done a service by shooting that wolf, because he feels like reducing the number of wolves in those woods will bring the elk back up. Now, if you talk to wildlife managers, the people that run and manage wolves and elk in the state of Wyoming, they will say, no, that hunters can't shoot enough wolves to bring the number of elk back up in that part of the park. And I discussed that with him, but he was not interested in hearing that point of view.
Of the organizations that you've seen working for wolf recovery, particularly with the system that you're talking about where they're under attack, do you have is there an organization that you've seen that seems to be the most effective?
Yes, the two most effective from my perspective have been Earth Justice, which is a group of lawyers that sort of have done the suing on behalf of wolves, and then a group called Defenders of Wildlife, which has done some amazing work on trying to reduce conflicts between ranchers and wolves. And there's been progress there, and there's cause for hope there. One of the things they've done, a lot of people don't realize that cattle and sheep are grazed on public land in the West. Everybody in the West knows that, but if you don't live in the West, they might not know that. And they don't realize that a lot of times when wolves get in trouble for preying on cattle and sheep, they are doing so in the national forest on public land. And when that happens, those ranchers can call a government trapper to come and shoot that wolf on his behalf free of charge. So you have this kind of catch-22 situation, and you have the one branch of the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, reintroducing predators on public land. Another branch, the Forest Service, leasing that same land to ranchers, encouraging them to bring essentially defenseless sheep and cows onto that land. And then a third branch, Wildlife Services, that will come and shoot that wolf when they inevitably prey on that livestock. It's insane. But the logic of it only makes sense if you live in the West and you've sort of been following this story kind of incrementally for the last 20 years. I'm not saying it is logical, but to them, it makes sense. So defenders have been trying to lower those conflicts by buying out those leases from the ranchers that control them with like a lump sum cash payment, and then convincing the Forest Service not to lease that land to anyone else again. And then also they go out and talk to ranchers with strategies for reducing conflicts, like range riders and dogs and things that our ancestors once did.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
Under the current political situation, is any of these protections for the wolves in the balance between the ranchers and wildlife protection being changed?
Well, I mean, a lot of the decisions that were made by the federal government that wolf advocates objected to were made during the Obama administration. You know, it was sort of the case that the federal government had been getting hammered for 2 decades on wolf reintroduction, and especially those Western congressmen had just been beating up on the president and on Congress, demanding that they be allowed to control those wolves. And the federal government just got tired of fighting, I think, and eventually said, you know, okay, we will turn control over. So it isn't as though, you know, wolf advocates, Obviously, they would prefer to have a Democratic administration in there, but it isn't as though they felt like they had a good advocate, for example, at the Fish and Wildlife Service during those days. But it is the case that after '06 died, there was a big backlash against wolf hunting, and there were a lot of positive developments. The hunt was stopped in Wyoming for several years. It has since been reinstated. But also this effort to take protection away from wolves sort of preemptively in the rest of the country in anticipation of when they might spread out of the northern Rockies and encounter ranch livestock elsewhere. That movement was sort of stopped dead in its tracks and doesn't seem to be going anywhere now. So there is cause for hope if you're a wolf advocate at this point, regardless of who's who's in the White House. Yeah.
You're speaking in the beginning that the first female wolf was suffering so badly from mange that she could hardly move or function. Was that an example of a disease that was in the wolf population to begin with, or is it something that had been introduced by outside animals or people? And what do you know about that as a dynamic in restoring the whole population?
Yeah, it's normal in any wild canine population to see mange or some of those other canine diseases you've heard about, dogs getting. Usually mange is not that serious. You'll see a little bit of it on a wolf. There'll be a patch of bare skin, and then gradually it's caused by these little mites, and gradually the mites will die and they'll recover. But if it does spread out of control, especially in the wintertime, then it can become fatal because, Yellowstone gets 30, 40 below, extremely deep snow, and so they can't survive. They get weaker and weaker, and eventually they're unable to hunt, and they starve to death. And that was what was starting to happen to the Druids. But no, it's not uncommon to see those, and sometimes disease will spread throughout Yellowstone, and they'll lose a lot to distemper or parvo. But it does speak to the importance of having interconnectedness between the various populations of wolves that are in the northern Rockies. Right now, they're kind of in three big isolated populations. There's the one in the Yellowstone area, there's the one in central Idaho, and then there's one sort of centered around Glacier National Park. And wolves do disperse between those three, but not as often as the biologists would like them to. And partly that's because now there's hunting and trapping seasons there. And also in Wyoming now controls its own wolf population, and they have an extremely repressive sort of wolf management regime. Wolves that are in sort of that northwest corner of the park, of the state where Yellowstone and Grand Teton are, there's a trophy hunting season there. But elsewhere, the killing is essentially unregulated. You can shoot them like coyotes over across 85% of the state. It's called the predator zone. And that's an example of the federal government, as I say, caving. That stipulation that Wyoming insisted on had been a deal killer for the feds for years and years and years and years, and finally they just threw up their hands and said, okay, if that's what you want to do.
Back to the point of the wolves being habituated to human presence, do you know of any kind of action that could mitigate that in some respect? For instance, people watching from a blind or some sort of thing like that?
Yeah. The biologists, they use the term tolerant of people, meaning that wolves have learned not to think of people at a certain distance as a threat. And so in Yellowstone, generally, you're watching wolves from a mile or two away, sometimes a little closer. But if you get too close to them, they will run, and they don't approach people. There's only been a couple of instances of visitors to the park feeding wolves, and those wolves became habituated and started approaching people in cars, and they had to be killed. But that's only happened a couple of times in 20 years. But this issue of how to deal with this tolerance of people, it is a real issue, especially once hunting started around the park, because you can't hunt in the park, obviously, but these wolves, they can travel 20 miles in a day, and all of the packs in the park will leave the park at one point or another. And all of those packs have lost wolves to hunting in the years since hunting began. In fact, a number of radio-collared wolves have been lost, so many that it's damaged the research project that's been going on for 20 years in the park. The obvious solution to that, would be some kind of buffer zone around the park in which hunting is not allowed. I guess you could say there's a limited version of that in the sense that the game managers in Wyoming and Idaho and Montana have agreed to limit the number of wolves that can be shot in that area just adjacent to the park. But the idea that there should be a buffer zone where no wolves can be shot is just a complete non-starter with state politicians in the area. You know, they look at that as a land grab, you know, by the federal government. And the feds have tried it before. They tried it back in the 80s, not around wolves, but just to help them better manage wildlife that are in the park, and they got shot down. So, you know, they got their hand burned on the stove, and they're not willing to try it again. So it's definitely an issue. And when I interviewed the hunter who shot 06, he told me that she came out of the willows. He was sounding a predator call, which makes a sound like a dying rabbit, and it's known to bring out coyotes and wolves. He said they came out of the willows, they saw him, and they just sat down and looked at him at like 200 yards away. And so that, of course, raises the question of whether it was ethical to shoot them, whether it was, as they say, fair chase or not to shoot them, which is a very sensitive issue for this particular hunter. He considers himself to be a very ethical hunter. And I think that's partly why he was sort of on the fence about whether what he did that day was ethical or not. Yeah, but it's a good question, and there's no good answer to it. Yes, sir.
Follow up with the surviving female or the surviving male, and if so, how did that work out?
Yeah, that was one of the points of the book, was to document what happened to the pack after she was killed, and it was a disaster. The first thing that happened was her mate. It was mating season, so her mate, the longtime alpha male of the pack, had to leave the pack in order to find a new mate. Wolves, a pack is basically a family. Almost all the wolves in the pack are related, and wolves are reluctant to mate with wolves that they are related to. So he had to leave the pack, and so suddenly the pack was completely leaderless, had no alpha male and no alpha female. 06's departure caused the other female wolves in the pack to view each other as competitors, and they began to fight, and they shunned and drove off one of the younger female 2-year-olds. She went off as lone wolves do. It's very hard for a lone wolf to feed herself because the elk are so big, it usually takes a pack to bring down an elk. She was shot eating a chicken in someone's yard right outside the park. The male did eventually find, his name is 755, he did eventually find another mate, but when he did, he brought her back to the den that 06 had always used. And so she was there, and she was pregnant. And unfortunately, the rest of the Lamar pack came back to that den after having been east of the park for some time, sort of wandering in the wilderness. And they found her there, and to her, she was a strange wolf on their territory, and they attacked and killed her. So he lost 2 mates in a period of about 4 weeks. So yeah, that was part of the point. Like, part of the reason I made the book a story, like a narrative, is instead of just like a book-length essay about wolves, the story itself is part of the message of the book. You know, if you're like a game manager in a place like Wyoming, you spend all your time calculating how many wolves can you afford to lose to hunters, trappers, or on behalf of livestock before the feds will step back in and put them back on the endangered species list, and you'll lose control of the wolves. And the number is always in the hundreds, likewise in Idaho and Montana. And that's how they tend to think of wolves, at these large numbers. But the book asks people to consider what is the value of one wolf's life. And if every wolf leads an amazing adventure story, their life is this amazing adventure story. And 06 was not unusual. The only thing unusual about her is that we had enough details to be able to tell her story like this. Every wolf's life is like 06's life. And so if every wolf lives this amazing story, and every time a wolf is shot, not just a famous wolf, but all these hundreds of wolves that are anonymously shot in the Northern Rockies every year, then does it cause us to reevaluate the way that we make policy? Does it cause us to think twice about how we manage this animal in particular versus how we manage all the other animals, all the other game animals? But thank you for that question. Should we bring this in for a landing and go do the signing? Okay.
Thank our author tonight.
Thank you.
And